Okay. The additional research that has been related to medical errors is been reviewed by one of our instrumental people that is actually actively and heavily practicing in this area. Her name is Linda Aiken. She is responsible for a lot of research as it relates to staffing and medical errors. Linda Aiken was also one of the pioneers in getting the information that was responsible for the California Legislative Act of 2004. And in this, it was developed in 2004, and it just practically made it a law that nurses' ratio should be in the range of 1:1 based on where you're working to 1:6 based on the different areas of the hospital where you were working. So she kind of made it strategic for that practice. The California legislature also has some different avenues to it. There are 14 states that actually are practicing or have adopted this act, and there are 16 states that are actually having additional regulations as it relates to the use of overtime. And that overtime generally is only to be used in the event that there is a state of emergency. So it has been researched and it has been identified that working these extended hours does have a negative effect. And Florida is not in either of those numbers. There are some additional guidelines, as you can see, as this relates. And these guidelines have been outlined through Aiken and some of the other researchers. And there's also an organization called the National Guidelines Clearinghouse. They are also instrumental in developing general-based guidelines, but you always want to follow the policies of your facility. With this and the National Clearinghouse, not only are these guidelines related to the nurses, you have pharmacists, the provider, the provider is also responsible for this, and the other ancillaries in there. So it's not just nurses that are responsible for these things. So you definitely want to make sure that you are adhering to the guidelines of your facility as it relates to quality improvement. Guidelines regarding education. Education is something that should be ongoing within your facility. Not only should the staff be educated at orientation, you should be reinforced through different trainings that are offered throughout the year as well. The residents should also be educated. They should be educated upon admission, upon discharge, and ongoing. So you want to make sure that you are preventing them from having errors once they go home by educating them on the proper information as it relates to their diagnosis. The prescribers should also be aware of different practices for the facility before they join the facility and know what is required of them so that they're not causing us to make medical errors. And that same thing goes for all of the prescribers, pharmacists, consultants, and everybody else. And all of these processes should be kept on file within that facility and on each employee. Some interventions that you can use while you're practicing to ensure that you are following the current evidence-based practice is, we're going to talk about some of those, but something that you can do personally for yourself is to subscribe to some of the scholarly journals. And if you're working and you are not sure of the most current evidence-based practice, you can ask one of your co-workers, especially new grads. New grads sometimes have the most current evidence-based practice versus somebody who's been nursing for 10 years. So ask somebody or somebody that you're confident that will give you a good answer. And always, again, review the policies of your facility. And some of those nurses' interventions are here. So you want to make sure, again, strict compliance with established protocols of your facility. Always go to your facility protocol first. And using 2 forms of identification, these are just some examples of some things that you can do to do that. Therapeutic effect, which we talked about. Precautions in accessing the patient and using the parameters. And monitor your own overtime. I know we nurses, we generally will double up if we know we need that extra check or, but monitor your own overtime because you need to protect you and be a safe practice nurse. And supervisors. Do we have any supervisors here in the building tonight? Any supervisors? Okay, well, there are some guidelines for supervisors. With the supervisors, we're going to review some of the interventions that the supervisor can take in order to assist in being some safe practice nurses. And these are, again, some more guidelines for us to be informed on. So with the 12-hour shifts, if 12-hour shifts are mandatory, that supervisor is responsible for making sure that that nurse is taking adequate breaks, that if they are doing a double shift, that they are taking the necessary time off. If they aren't doing the 12-hour shifts, because you can't do a double if you're doing 12s. But if you're doing 8-hour shifts, if you have to work a double, make sure you're not back-to-back double, because you need that extra time off. And some other interventions, you want to spread it out. If I'm scheduling, I want to make sure that I'm not just letting one nurse pick up all the overtime. Make sure you spread it out. And another thing, an intervention for a supervisor, is the skill mix of the shift. If I know I have a BSN nurse, a regular ADN nurse, we want to make sure that we have a combination of everybody, you know, because your skills may be higher than my skills, and I need somebody that I can feel confident in coming to ask for help if I need to. So you always want to make sure you can manage the skill mix of the shift. And just develop a good practice guidelines. If you identify that a nurse that always is picking up overtime is the nurse that is making all the mid errors, you know why. Because they're working overtime, and it can be very unsafe for that nurse as well as the patient for them picking up that extra overtime. And most of that errors are related to fatigue of the nurse. So make sure you're monitoring your overtime. And evidence-based research also is driven by budget. I know at my facility I don't like that budget word, because they staff based upon the budget, but you should not staff based upon the budget. You need to staff based upon the needs of the clients. So you definitely want to make sure that you're not focusing on that budget. And you know, there are some strategic ways that we can do scheduling that, you know, on one shift I know I have 2 stronger nurses that are working, you know, I can make sure that I have them available and they'll be there to assist. So don't be so quick to jump at the offer to make extra money. Always be aware of safe practices. And in conclusion, just remember the incidence of mortality as it relates to working extended hours. And adequate nursing, if you have adequate nursing, it actually saves lives. Adequate nursing actually, in over more than 50% of the cases, adequate nursing does save lives. And the negative outcomes, you know, they have, like we talked about needle sticks, strains, sprains, falls for the clients. There are a whole lot of negative outcomes that can happen because of fatigue. And just remember your safe practices. Nurses, remember, protect yourself, monitor your overtime, and supervisors, use strategic practices, but don't always work based upon the census. You want to make sure that you are allowing the nurses adequate time off and adequate placement within their shifts to maintain safe practices for the nurse as well as the patients. Thank you.